Yo, YouTube, what's up with your boy? Sports and Fitness Rants. I'm back, guys. Click that like button. Subscribe to my channel. What's up, y'all? Welcome back, guys. Welcome back, man. Got another great video for you guys today, as usual, man. You guys know the deal on this channel. So about setting the record straight, stopping the lies, stopping the narratives, stopping them from rewriting history, guys. And in this video, this is a subscriber requested video. Shout out to Big Ticket RIQ for coming through and requesting this video. Now, you requested this video a long time ago. I meant to do a video on this, a while ago, and I just came across this. And so forgive me, my man, Big Ticket RIQ, that has hit me up several times with video requests on Instagram. Shout out to all you guys on Instagram that hit me up. But he asked me, who I thought the best 5 defensive teams that I've ever seen. Now, it's not of all time. The best 5 defensive teams that I've ever seen play in my lifetime. All right, so you guys know I go back to the late 80s, right, into the 90s. That's the perspective that I'm always trying to give you guys. So this is not of all time, but I came up with 5 teams that, to me, that I saw play live, to me, are the top 5 defensive teams that I've seen. Remember, it's not of all time, guys, just I've seen. So once again, shout out to Big Ticket RIQ for asking me this, to do a video on this. And I want to thank you guys, everyone across the world, everyone across the states have been supporting my channel. Once again, you guys know I'm truly humbled, man. But all support, it's humbling for you guys to request videos from me, for you guys to donate to my channel, the questions, the comments. Like I said, you guys sharing your stories with me. It means a lot. So thank you very much to all you guys out there. And you guys know what to do. Turn the volume all the way up. Hit that play button. Remember, these videos are for educational purposes. And let's roll. So yes, guys, like I said, shout out to my man Big Ticket RIQ for requesting this video, asking me who are the 5 best offensive teams that I've seen, since I've been watching basketball. So, like I said, guys, to reiterate, this is not the 5 greatest defensive teams of all time. This is not that. There's a list of the 5 best defensive teams, the 5 greatest offensive teams that I've seen in my lifetime that I actually watched live. So let's understand that, all right? I'm not trying to do a definitive list of the top 5 greatest offensive teams in NBA's history. But I came up with 5 teams that I watched play live as the 5 best defensive teams. There's no order here. I'm not doing an order. He didn't ask me to do an order. I don't think the order is important here. It doesn't matter 1 through 5, none of this stuff. These are the 5 best teams, or the greatest defensive teams that I've seen, guys, since I've been watching basketball, since I remember watching basketball, since about 1988, all right? Somewhere around there is when I remember watching basketball. A lot of this stuff, you guys can tell, I got a pretty good memory with a lot of this stuff, man. Like I told you, I grew up watching this stuff. My dad played basketball in the streets, man. We always had it on the radio. My dad would be watching a lot of this stuff. So I grew up watching this stuff, like I said, playing the game, playing sports my entire life, still to this day. So the 5 teams that I came up with, guys, were the Detroit Pistons of the late 80s, right? I had the Detroit Pistons from about 87 to about 1991. They were a top-notch defense those years. I came up with the Detroit Pistons of the early 2000s. I figured that was, to me, one of the teams I remember watching. I mean, these guys were just stout. And I came up with the early 2000s Pistons, 2003, 2004, 2005. To me, that 3-year window there, they were sensational. I came with the San Antonio Spurs of the early 2000s, man. I mean, you could pretty much say the San Antonio Spurs of the 2000s. Just from 1999 to 2009, the San Antonio Spurs were just outstanding. So the Spurs defense, to me, of the early 2000s, sensational defense. I went with the Knicks defense from the early 90s. To me, the Knicks defense, I mean, essentially the Knicks defense from about 1992 to about 1999, guys. The Knicks defense was sensational. They were stout. They probably are the best, most consistently best defense of the 90s, guys. Not the Bulls. I would probably say it was the Knicks. As far as consistently being a top-notch defense throughout the 90s, the New York Knicks will probably have that mantle. And then obviously the Chicago Bulls of the late 90s, that second three-peat, 96, 97, 98. I think we all knew I was going to have the Chicago Bulls on this list. Now, let's go through some of these defenses a little bit more in detail to understand why I selected these 5 defenses. Were there other great defenses that I could have mentioned? Yeah, absolutely. There was a couple other teams. The Seattle Supersonics of the mid to late 90s had a really stout defensive team. The Utah Jazz in the early 90s, had a really stout defensive team with Karl Malone, John Stockton, Mark Eaton, They were known for being a stout defensive team. The Miami Heat of the mid to late 90s, when Pat Riley came over, they were a very, very stout defensive team. I don't know, the late 90s, the Miami Heat, they were very tough defensively. The Cleveland Cavaliers were a solid defensive team in the early 90s. That late 80s, early 90s, the Cleveland Cavaliers, when you had guys like Larry Nance on that team and Craig Elo, and you had guys like Brad Daugherty and Hot Rod Williams, Ron Harper was on that late 80s Cavaliers team. But you had some solid defensive teams in the history of the NBA, obviously, but from those time periods I'm talking about. But to me, these were the 5 teams that to me were the best defenses that I've seen. And one of the things that we have to understand about these defenses is that every one of these defenses that I mentioned was led or had multiple all-time great defenders on them. Now, I want to start with, let's start with the Pistons of the late 80s, guys. Let's go with the Pistons from the late 80s here. And like I told you, for me, now I wrote down some notes here to make sure that I hit on some of these points that I wanted to make. The Detroit Pistons of the late 80s, right into that early 90s, to me, those years, like I said, about 87, 88, 89, 90, and 91, guys, the Detroit Pistons were a top 5 defense every one of those years. The interesting thing was, I found out, like I said, when you look into some of this stuff, is that the Detroit Pistons from the late 80s into early 90s were never the number 1 defense. They were never the number 1 defense in the NBA. The Boston Celtics were number 1 defense, I believe, in 1986 or one of those years. The Utah Jazz were the number 1 defense, I believe, some of those years in the late 80s. Like in 88, the Detroit Pistons were the number 2 defense. The number 1 defense was the Utah Jazz that year, 1988. In 1989, they were the number 3 defense. The Utah Jazz were the number 1 defense that year. So some of these teams were very stout defensively, but the Pistons were top 5 defense from 87 to 1991. One of the really things that was impressive with a lot of these defensive teams that I'm mentioning here, the San Antonio Spurs and New York Knicks, for example, right, those 2 teams, is that what made these defenses so great is that they were consistently really great. So, sometimes you'll see a team that has maybe a great defensive year. So like one year, they're great on defense, right? Then the next year, they kind of fall off, right? These teams, the Detroit Pistons, the New York Knicks in particular, the San Antonio Spurs, they were consistently great for a good period of time, for consecutive seasons, guys. So the Detroit Pistons were a number 1 defense for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 years in a row, they were a top 5 defense at Detroit Pistons. But like I mentioned, they were led by all-time great defenders. And in an instance of Dennis Rodman, you can argue, and I've said this before, that Dennis Rodman, to me, is the most versatile defender in NBA's history, guys. So you had Dennis Rodman on that team. Remember, Defensive Player of the Year award winner in back-to-back years, 1990 and 1991. Dennis Rodman was Defensive Player of the Year award winner. But you had first-team all-defensive members like Joe Dumars and Dennis Rodman leading the charge. But also had guys like Bill Laimbeer, who was a very solid defensive player, defensive-minded kind of player. Right? You had guys like Rick Mahorn on that team who were defensive-minded players. Right? You had guys like John Sally, who was a shot blocker, a challenger, rim protector. Right? But you had guys like Isaiah Thomas who gave effort on the defensive end. Right? These guys not known as defenders, but they gave effort, being the Microwave Johnson. Right? These guys gave effort on the defense. But you're led by 2 elite defenders in Joe Dumars and Dennis Rodman. And also, when we talk about Dennis Rodman, it was just defense. It was defense and rebounding, which helps your team on the defensive end. His rebounding goes to his defensive prowess. Joe Dumars, one of the great perimeter defenders of his era. So that defense was led by 2 all-time great defenders, Joe Dumars and Dennis Rodman. That's what made the Detroit Pistons defense so formidable. Not to mention they were very well coached, and not to mention they were tough and physical, dirty to a degree. Right after the whistle, they're hitting guys. They're doing a lot of weird stuff out there. And remember, back in them days, the Detroit Pistons were allowed to be physical to that degree. They could beat you up and not have to be worried about getting a flagrant foul or getting ejected. It would just be a regular common foul. Right? And they won back-to-back championships off the strength of their intensity and their defense. Right? Their toughness. So the Detroit Pistons, to me, you can argue they're one of the greatest defensive teams of all time, because of what they brought to the table individually and physically, team-wise. Very excellent team defense. Talk about guys being in the right positions, right? Then let's focus on the Detroit Pistons of the early 2000s. Because out of these teams, the Detroit Pistons of the early 2000s, to me, it was a weird scenario for the Detroit Pistons in the early 2000s. And I'm focusing on the years 2003, 2004, 2005, and 2006, guys. Those 4 years, the Detroit Pistons were a top 5 defense, 4 consecutive seasons. Once again, like the Detroit Pistons in the late into early 90s, the late 80s into early 90s, the Detroit Pistons in the early 2000s, guys, was never a number 1 defense. Never ranked number 1 in defense. And that's often because of the San Antonio Spurs and them being ranked essentially number 1 almost every year, the San Antonio Spurs in the early 2000s. So their best ranking was number 2 in 2004 when they won the championship. And the number 1 defense in 2004 was the San Antonio Spurs. So they were the number 2 defense right behind the Spurs, the Pistons. And we're talking about the Detroit Pistons and their ability to lock you down. I mean, they were holding teams to like 70 points, the Detroit Pistons. Once again, they were very well coached. And you're led by an all-time great defensive player in Ben Wallace. Ben Wallace was the leader of that defense, but you also had capable defenders. You had a really good defensive wing play like Tayshaun Prince, right? You also had someone like Chauncey Billups who gave effort and was a stout guy at that point guard position, the way he was powerfully built. Chauncey Billups. Rip Hamilton at the shooting guard position, even though he was more of a frail kind of player or thinly built, he gave a lot of effort, Rip Hamilton, and he seemed to never get tired, Rip Hamilton, running around the court, but he gave effort on the defensive end. You had guys like Rasheed Wallace down low. That was tough, hard-nosed, defensive kind of guy in that post area. And we talk about, once again, Ben Wallace and the brilliance, right, of Ben Wallace. Rebounding, blocking shots, intimidating people, right? And just being an overall defensive anchor for that Detroit Pistons team that would ultimately win a championship in 2004 and go to back-to-back NBA Finals in 2004 and 2005. And I believe they went to like 5 or 6 straight Eastern Conference Finals. Same thing with the Detroit Pistons in the late 80s into early 90s. They went to like 5 straight Eastern Conference Finals, guys, right? 87, 88, 89, 90, 91. This is how stout they were. That's the consistency I'm talking about here. Let's go to the San Antonio. Let's go to the New York Knicks next. Well, let's go to the San Antonio Spurs next. To the San Antonio Spurs next to me, I mean, my goodness, this is where Tim Duncan's greatness gets elevated, gets highlighted here, right? And his consistent greatness on both sides of the ball, Tim Duncan. His impact and what he was able to do, galvanizing the people around him. Remember, Tim Duncan went to Wake Forest for 4 seasons, came into the NBA already ready to go. 1998, wins Rookie of the Year, All-NBA, and All-Defensive Team member his rookie season, guys. Once again, remember, by Tim Duncan's second season, 1999, he's a member of a championship team, right? Him helping someone like David Robinson capture an NBA championship. This is the impact of Tim Duncan. But I want you guys to think about something. The San Antonio Spurs in 1998, right? They were the number 2 defense, guys, in 1998. 1999, they were the number 1 defense. From what I've looked at, and remember, the San Antonio Spurs were a good defense in the 90s, in the mid to late 90s with David Robinson. Remember, they had Dennis Rodman there in 94 and 95. Guys like Sean Elliott. You had guys that played defense and gave effort on the Spurs. And like I said, you were anchored by an all-time great defender in David Robinson. But the Spurs, from 1998, guys, to 2009, they were a top 5 defense, guys. That's insane. And I want you guys to think about how many times they finished as a number 1 defense, the San Antonio Spurs. And this is what I mean when I'm talking about consistently being great on defense for all of those years. The Spurs were a formidable defensive team, man, which is why they won the championships that they won. So in 1999, they won the NBA Finals, right? And they lockout-shortened season, beat the New York Knicks in the Finals. They were the number 1 defense. In 2000, they were the number 2 defense. 2001, number 1 defense. 2002, number 2 defense. 2003, number 3 defense. 2004, number 1 defense. 2005, number 1 defense. 2006, number 1 defense. So they were the number 1 defense, guys. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 different seasons in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So out of 8 seasons, 5 of them, they were the number 1 defense. The other seasons, they were number 2, and number 3. This is insane, guys. 07, they were number 2. 08, they were number 3. And in 2009, they were number 5. So as you guys can see, this is a bigger reason why the Spurs were winning championships. 1999, they won a championship, number 1 defense. 2003, they won a championship, number 3 defense. 2005, they won a championship, number 1 defense. 2007, they won a championship, number 2 defense, guys. So if we think about that, and you're talking about the numbers-wise, what the Spurs were doing, once again, they were holding teams to 80 points, 70 points. Remember that early 2000s, it was tough to score against the Spurs. But why were the Spurs so great on defense? Because they had all-time great defenders like David Robinson. Even though David Robinson was older, we get it. He was, in his last several years, but he was still a very good defensive player at that age. David Robinson in 1998 and 1999 and 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003. David Robinson was still very, very capable. But you had Tim Duncan there all those years, and you see once again the presence of Tim Duncan, what he does for the people around him, what his impact is on the defensive end. All those years, there were 5 different times they were the number 1 defense when Tim Duncan was there. That's insane. And then you had also guys like Bruce Bowen there. Right? Other guys that came through there, the Steven Jacksons, the Boris Diaws, some of these other guys that played for the Spurs. But you had Tim Duncan, David Robinson, and a guy like Bruce Bowen, who was an elite level perimeter defender in the early 2000s, guys. Right? Bruce Bowen, the physical nature that he was allowed to play with, and his effort and hustle on the defensive end. He was one of the elite defensive wings at that time with guys like Kobe Bryant and the Shane Battiers, the Doug Christies, the Andre Kirilinkos. Like, to me, these were the top-notch defenders on the perimeter, right? Guys that could guard a shooting guard, and a small forward, and some of these guys could guard power forwards. So shout out to Bruce Bowen. So you see, the Spurs and how consistent they were. You see the consistency there, guys? All of those years. And then in 2010, that was the first year out of all those years, guys, that they went to 8th on defense. So they were still a top 10 defense, just not a top 5 defense. That's called greatness from Tim Duncan and the San Antonio Spurs, man. They were a lockdown defense. Let's go to the New York Knicks next. Because similar to the San Antonio Spurs of the 2000s, the Knicks, like I told you, to me, were probably the most consistently great defense for the 90s. Better than the Bulls defense. Maybe not as far as one particular season. Like, we wanted to highlight the 96 Bulls and what they could do. They're probably a greater defensive team than any of the one specific Knicks years, like 92 or 93 or 96, let's say. But the greatness of the Knicks comes in their consistency, the longevity of how great they were on defense throughout the entire 90s, guys. Right? They were just more consistently in a top 5 defense than any other teams in the 90s. The Knicks, guys, they were formidable. The 1992 Knicks, the 1993 Knicks. To me, guys, those are the best New York Knicks teams since the merger. Right? Since the merger in 76. Remember, the Knicks had not back-to-back champions. They won championships in 1970 and in 1973. So the Knicks haven't won a championship since then. But to me, that 92 Knicks team, the 93 Knicks team, like those 2 Knicks teams, to me, those are probably the greatest Knicks teams that I've seen. I've never seen any Knicks team better than those Knicks teams, guys. And the only reason why those Knicks teams did not win a championship, they're the only team on this list that did not win a championship, guys, is because they played against Michael Jordan in Michael Jordan's era. But that's how formidable and great the New York Knicks team was, guys. Think about this. 1992, when Pat Riley took over the New York Knicks, he turned that franchise completely around, right? With his mindset, his attitude, his toughness, right? The way that he had the Knicks playing defense, using physicality, but not being dirty like the Detroit Pistons. The Knicks took a page from the Pistons, but they were just a physical, stout defensive team, man, that was led by some really good defensive players. So Pat Riley came over in 92. The Knicks were number 2 defense that year. Then in 1993, the Knicks were the number 1 defense. 1994, they were the number 1 defense. 1995, they were the number 1 defense. So similar to the Spurs, where they had 3 consecutive seasons, right, of the number 1 defense, the Spurs, right? They were the number 1 defense 04, 05, and 06, 3 years in a row. Same thing for the Knicks. 93, 94, 95, the Knicks were the number 1 defense in the league. Remember, the Knicks had 60 wins in 1993, home court advantage over the Chicago Bulls in the Eastern Conference Finals. And they were a very formidable defensive team. The number 1 defense. They were up 2-0, and then the Bulls stormed back and won 4 in a row. That Knicks team was, like I said, very, very formidable. Then the next year, they went to the NBA Finals, right? And they lost in 7 games to the Houston Rockets. The New York Knicks could have won that series. They were very tough defensively, which made them formidable, which got them in those positions. And then in 1995, once again, they were number 1 defense again. And we talk about 1996. They were number 4. 1997, they were number 2. All right. 1998, they were number 4. And in 1999, they were number 4 in defense. Remember, 1999, they were the first 8 seed to make an NBA Finals. Right? They made NBA Finals in 1999, the lockout showing season. We get that. Lost to the Spurs. But they were number 4 defense that year. And the players leading the New York Knicks defense was a great all-time great defensive player, Patrick Ewing, who, like I told you, if Patrick Ewing did not play in the era he played, and let's say he played in the 2000s, right, or played in the 2010s, Patrick Ewing would probably have about 3 or 4 Defensive Player of the Year awards, especially if he played in the 2010s. He would dominate a guy like Rudy Gobert, dominate someone like Rudy Gobert. But Patrick Ewing had to stand behind guys like Dikembe Mutombo, David Robinson, Hakeem Olajuwon. Remember, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was still in the NBA when he came. Moses Malone was still in the NBA when he came in. Guys like Mark Eaton, Brad Daugherty, the Robert Parishes. These are guys that Patrick Ewing was going against, man. Shaquille O'Neal, Alonzo Mourning, right? Great defensive players, which kind of stopped someone like Patrick Ewing from getting those accolades. But the Knicks were led by Patrick Ewing, John Starks, who to me was, once again, one of the grittiest, scrappiest players I've ever seen in my life. Guy was really focused, studied the film on Michael Jordan. Like, he came prepared, John Starks. He gave that effort, man. He was a people's champ. Like I said, one of the fan favorites over there in New York. Charles Oakley, another stout defensive guy who gave effort on defense down low. Anthony Mason, Gerald Wilkins. To me, these were their top-notch defensive players for the New York Knicks some of those years. They would end up getting guys like Derek Harper, who was a very solid defensive player in that second, during that late 90s, right? The Knicks, Derek Harper came over, very solid defensive player. But the New York Knicks, and then the Chicago Bulls, guys, to me, probably we can argue the greatest defensive team of all time because of the players that they had on the court and what they could do team-wise. Like, you know, what those guys could do individually, which made them so much of a formidable team, guys, because of the defenders that were leading the charge on that team. Now, Chicago Bulls, I'm talking about the second three-peat Bulls, 96, 97, 98. It's only 3 years here that we're highlighting, guys, because Dennis Rodman would leave in 98 after 98. Michael Jordan would leave after 1998. So it wasn't the same team. But in 1996, right, that historic season, they were the number 1 defense, right, the number 1 offense, insane, right? 1997, they were the number 4 defense. And then in 1998, they were the number 3 defense. I want you guys to think about something, though. What I just said there. In 1998, the Bulls were the number 3 defense. They finished as the number 3 defense that year. You remember they won 60-plus games that year. You remember Scottie Pippen missed half the season. What, did he miss 40 games that year? So the Chicago Bulls, led by Michael Jordan, still won 60 games, even though Scottie Pippen, who's the greatest player in the NBA's history, according to LeBron James fans, Scottie Pippen missed half the season. They still won 60 games. But on top of that, the Bulls still managed to be a number 3 defense with Scottie Pippen, who's one of the elite defenders, missing half the season. This is how great that team was defensively, guys, led by Michael Jordan, Dennis Rodman, Ron Harper on the defensive end. Scottie Pippen missed half the season, still finished as a number 3 defense that year. That's how stout this team was. All right, so once again, Scottie Pippen, he was a great player, right? Scottie Pippen, but they try to pump him up and exaggerate really how great he actually was and the impact of him. So I told you, about top 5 defense those 3 consecutive years. And once again, you're led by all-time great defenders. Right? You're led by Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and Dennis Rodman. Ron Harper. These are the 4 best defensive players for that second three-peat Bulls. And you're talking about 4 guys at the position that they play that could essentially cover everyone on the court. Ron Harper could guard 1, 2s, and 3s with his height and his long arms. Michael Jordan could guard 1, 2s, and 3s with his height, his long arms, his athleticism, his instincts, his high IQ on the defensive end. Scottie Pippen could guard probably 1, 2, 3s, maybe some 4s, with his ability to get up and down the court, the long arms of Pippen, his ability to move the feet, and his effort on defense. Scottie Pippen, these guys gave effort. And then Dennis Rodman, who could guard literally 1 through 5, maybe not the second three-peat. That wasn't the same Dennis Rodman. Right, he got a little heavier, gained a little weight, lost some of his athleticism, got a little older, 36, 37 years old. But Dennis Rodman could guard small forwards, power forwards, centers at that time. So essentially, with those 4 players on the court, you could guard anyone out there on the court, guys. And once again, the high IQ of those guys and the effort that they were giving on the defensive end is part of the reason why a lot of people look at the Chicago Bulls of 1996 as the greatest team of all time, but also the greatest defensive team of all time, because you had 3 all-defensive first-team members on one team. And I believe that's the only time in NBA's history that you've had that. Jordan, Pippen, Rodman. 1996, all defensive first-team members. And like I said, you have Ron Harper, who's an honorable mention for all defensive team. So, as you guys can see, San Antonio Spurs won several championships, you know, because of the defense, the consistency, the greatness of Tim Duncan. The Detroit Pistons, the early 2000s, led by Ben Wallace, Tayshaun Prince, Chauncey Billups win a championship in 04, beating the mighty Los Angeles Lakers. The Pistons in the late 80s and early 90s won back-to-back championships, right? Think about it. You had the Lakers in 87, 88 win back-to-back championships. That was the first time since the Celtics that a team had won back-to-back championships. And then the next 2 years, the Pistons do it. So you had the Lakers 87, 88. Then you had what? The Pistons 90, 91. And then you had a three-peat. 89, 90. And then the Bulls a three-peat. So essentially, you see all those teams won consecutive championships in a row. It's crazy when you think about that, guys. But all these teams won championships. The Bulls second three-peat, except for the Knicks. Because the Knicks went against the greatness of the Chicago Bulls. But you saw the consistency of the defense of the New York Knicks in that early of the 90s, guys. They were formidable, man. So once again, shout out to Big Ticket RIQ. I know this video went on kind of long. To me, those were the 5 best defenses that I saw. Like I said, from the late 80s to now, to me, those are the best defenses. Over the last 5-10 years, we don't really talk about defense like that. So, we could talk about the Golden State Warriors and their defense. We could talk about the Oklahoma City Thunder of this past season and what they were doing defensively. But like I told you, where's the consistency? I want to see the Oklahoma City Thunder play really top-notch defense this coming season. Not saying they're win a championship, but let me see you be a top 3 defense, again, consecutive years. Let me see you do it for consecutive seasons. Then we could talk about you being a historical defense. You guys get this, what I'm saying here? You guys understand, man. You guys know the deal. I'll catch you guys on the next one.